Hey guys, welcome back. We're going to get through chapter 8 here and finish up part 1 of 1984. So let's get right into it. Now, much of this chapter is showing these sensory flashes of the past, which are calling out to Winston. And the first one of these starts at the very beginning of the chapter, where Winston's walking along and he smells real roasting coffee. Not victory coffee, but, the real deal, actual roasting coffee. And this elicits these memories of his childhood. We can assume that the coffee is being roasted by the proles because party members wouldn't have access. They only have the victory coffee, remember, and victory products. And it's where Orwell deems this free market, or I've also called it a black market, where the proles have access to these other goods that the party doesn't produce. So Winston's out walking and he's missed his community center 3 times this week. The community center is, again, a sort of double speak term, because when you think of a community center, or at least when I grew up, the community center was the place where the tennis courts were at, the pool tables were at, friends would go, especially where I grew up in Tennessee. It's raining a lot in certain times of the year, or cold, so we would go inside to a community center. But you think about a community center as it's an optional place, like any other place in our free society. You don't have to be there. It's just another place that you can go. Your tax dollars fund it, but it's not any sort of requirement that you be there. But in this society, because Winston has missed his community center time 3 times this week, it's going to start raising some concerns, because the attendance there is not checked or mandated, but hypothetically, Winston notes that party members have no spare time, no alone time. You're expected to use your spare time at communal activities, and the only time you should really be alone is when you're in bed. Okay. Other than that, when you're at home, sure, if you don't have a family, but they really don't want people having alone time. And you would ask, well, why is that, right? Why is it so bad that somebody go for a walk by themselves? And the first thing I think of is, well, that's a time when you might think, right? If you're by yourself, alone, going for a walk, I think it's natural that you might be in your head and actually start thinking about things, and that's not something that the party really condones. So Winston missing his community center time 3 times this week is definitely going to start raising some eyebrows, and he's aware of that, and he's entering dangerous territory when it comes to being investigated for thought crime. And we've seen this throughout part 1. Winston's sort of slipping down a road which is against party ideology, right? At first, he's pretty much following the rules, but it all began with the start of that journal. And once he began that journal, now he's on this kind of slippery slope to where he's going to start raising eyebrows from the party and potentially become investigative for thought crime if he keeps this up. So just remember the idea of, communal. Communal is like group versus individual, which is alone and in solitude. And this is, one of the big political concepts that we're looking at in 1984 is communal versus individual. I mean, these are the basic kind of, if you were going to boil down capitalist and communist into, how are they represented by people? Communal and individual would be a good way to look at it. That's not to say there is no individuality in communism. I think it's a sort of natural thing for humans to have individuality to some extent. But then at the same time, that's not to say there's no communal, gathering in capitalism either. But those are just kind of the 2 ends of the spectrum, the 2 poles that we can think about. Winston notes that this has a doublespeak word called own life, which refers to being eccentric and being an individual, being individualistic. So that's called own life, and it undoubtedly has a derogatory connotation. you don't want to be seen as having an own life in the party. Another thing I've noted in the past, but you begin to actually see more of it in this chapter, especially with the dialogue between Winston and the old man and Winston and Mr. Charrington, you see the Prole dialect. And so in a lot of books, definitely in movies and media, you hear people take on an accent or speak in a particular way. Now, what Orwell is doing is writing so that we can hear that accent as a sensory detail, as imagery. So the Prole dialect is very similar to basically what a British English would have sounded like in lower class areas of a place like London. In our mind as Americans, if we're not familiar with British English, it might just sound like British English. Within that, UK English, British English, there are definitely dialects, just like we have here in the United States. We have, Southern dialect, Northeastern, or like Boston dialects. So not being a citizen of UK, I'm not super familiar with that. So maybe you all can let me know if you understand what exact dialect Orwell is referring to here. But if I had to guess, it would just be that maybe sort of a lower class, an indication of lower class because of the way that they speak the Queen's English. Just a quick example of the Prole dialect. In my book, if we look at page 83, we get a quick example of the Prole dialect. And it's between two female shopkeepers talking outside. Just a quick example. One says, "Yes, I says to her." So, using apostrophes to take out consonant sounds, soft consonant sounds like the H, just makes the reader be able to create that image in your mind of what these accents would sound like. It's a phonetic sort of writing. So Winston, it seems like ever since he started this journal, he's having this kind of yearning to be with the Proles and to be in their area. The thought police would definitely be curious why he's down there, but he thinks he's at least safe for now. One thing that's interesting that happens is a bomb strikes where Winston is walking in the Prole town and he has to take cover. It blows up a building and he sees a dismembered hand, which he kicks into the gutter. And it just kind of shows this dehumanization and how the Proles seem to be the ones who are taking the hits of the war. They seem to be the ones who are suffering the consequences of the war. We haven't heard of any bombs striking the party area of town. And I wonder if that is purposefully omitted. I try to teach my students that in literature, all the choices are intentional. Now, that's up for debate. If you view all the choices as intentional, then you can use a kind of formalist critique to just critique the book for what is there. Now, if you bring in other kinds of critiques, like maybe a biographical or historical critique, then you might understand the reason behind these decisions or the intent behind these decisions as being different. But in my first reading, I like to just assume that all the choices that Orwell makes are intentional as, good art. And I think that might be one of the things that you can use to define what art is these intentional choices. So the fact that we haven't seen a bomb strike in the party area of town is meant to tell us something. And it's most likely that, it's only the Prole area that's taking this damage from the war. And that's interesting to think about. Why is that happening? So as Winston's walking through the Prole area, I think a lot of this inspiration from this section comes from Orwell's other works like Road to Wigan Pier and Down and Out in Paris and London, where he's really describing this sort of not broken, but a very lower class area who is largely suffering. And, whether this is a critique of capitalism or a critique of, the party's impact, I think Orwell is mainly just saying, hey, this is true. And, as a socialist, he really wanted to point out the suffering of working people to make people understand their plight and think about how we could, make things better. So a lot of this, I believe, is coming, allegorically straight from his experiences in the streets and talking with lower class and working class people. For example, how the proles loved the lottery, and how the lottery is kind of set up in a way so that it feeds off of the lower classes, even though the odds of winning a lottery are astronomically low. And Winston even knows, as a party member, he has inside knowledge that the lottery in 1984 only actually awards small prizes, and the big prizes went to imaginary persons. So they made up the winners to make it seem like people were winning, but nobody really is. It's this kind of exploitation of ignorance and lack of education that is often seen in lower class areas, or being perpetrated on lower class people. They don't understand that the lottery is such a risky move to pay your hard-earned money for every day. But it's also hope, and it symbolizes, that idea that maybe you can elevate yourself out of your conditions, because if you feel so helpless, like nothing you do will be able to move you up in society, then maybe the lottery is your only hope. It's that kind of lack of class mobility that is a real critique of capitalism, and a real critique of, here in 1984, the way that the party subjugates the proles as a kind of slave class. The people are very superstitious, predicting lottery numbers and selling lucky amulets that are going to make you win the lottery. Superstition often fills in gaps where people don't have enough information about their world. So this brings us to the part where Winston sees an old prole man who may remember old London. Now, he remembers that many of the old people were wiped out in the purges. And this again connects me back to Gulag Archipelago. If you're interested in learning more about the Soviet Union, check out my series on that, where I describe how the Soviet Union systematically wiped out its own citizens in these waves of purges of, let's say old people, or of churches or engineers or students, and etc. So he believes that most of the old people were wiped out in the purges, and he has an opportunity to ask an old person and say, hey, I read this history book. Remember the children's history book a few chapters back? He read this history book and he wants to understand what's true and what isn't. And since he can't remember, maybe an old prole will. And remember, Winston keeps reciting this idea that if there is hope, it lies in the proles. And that's kind of why he's being drawn to them at this moment. Winston overhears that the old man is having an argument with the bartender over liter versus pint measurements. Now, this is a reference to the old British systems of measurement. For example, you have currency like the pound, which was unique to Britain. They did not have the EU system of the euro, right? They have their own system as a tradition, and measurements like pints, which are not in the metric system. But now everything has been converted to the metric system. And so I'm not sure whether this is exactly a critique of, the EU, where I think broadly it's more of this idea of globalization and going back to communal versus individual, rather than individual countries having their own individual systems that come from tradition. Everything has been kind of normalized. And so this whole region of Oceania has one system. And ironically, they use the metric system for, their liters and drinking and things like that. But for currency, they're on the dollar. And so I think that's interesting how, maybe this is Orwell predicting what are the systems that are the most persuasive, or the ones that are the most commonplace, and then over time they will gradually take over. So, the US dollar is very strong and has a lot of influence overseas. Obviously, this is 2020, so, things are a little bit upside down, but in the past, the dollar has been sort of the global currency, or the currency of finance, at least. And so maybe that's where Orwell is predicting that, eventually everybody in this region will be on the dollar. And the same thing goes for the metric system in the European Union. Winston's seeking wisdom from the older generation, and he kind of wants to hear the anecdotes of this old man. And that's something that I would really encourage all of you to do. If you have grandparents, if you're lucky enough to still have them around, then you should really go out of your way to ask them about their past and their history, and learn as much as you can from them, because anecdotal history is very important and it's real. While it's not, data or anything like that, every person's experience is valuable, and I think you could still learn a lot from talking to people who have lived in the past, and just ask them, what was their life like? How were things different? What did they like? What did they enjoy about how they grew up? What do they enjoy about how they're living now? And just so you can get a feel for what things were like from a person who you know and trust. Now, this old man uses a term that I love here, the lackeys of the bourgeoisie, and he refers to the Labor Party. And so remember, in Orwell's time, Orwell is a socialist, and in the in Britain, or the UK, the Labour Party represents the sort of left socialist party, like what the Democratic Party in the United States was, more so in the 60s and 70s. Not as much now, but maybe that would be more of a progressive party. So the Labor Party, as it says in the name, labor is meant to represent workers, right? And that was at least what the Democratic Party was meant to do. But he refers to them as the lackeys of the bourgeoisie. And so maybe this comes to what I was, referring to just a moment ago, the fact that, they are not necessarily serving the interests of the people they're meant to represent, right? The Labor Party should be representing the laborers. But if you're the lackeys of the bourgeoisie, then that means your goals or your purpose has shifted, and you are now working to serve the bourgeoisie, or the upper elite class, which is the antithesis of your stated goal as the Labor Party. Now, a lackey is a servant, especially a liveried footman or manservant. So this idea of being a servant to the bourgeoisie while being a Labor Party is very ironic. And it again, being that we're reading a satire, this is Orwell poking at his own parties in his own time. He's poking fun at them, saying, hey, you're neglecting your responsibility as the Labor Party to do what you said you're going to do and be there for working people. So as he's talking to the old man, Winston doesn't really have enough knowledge of the past to understand this old man in context. Like, this Labor Party joke goes right over Winston's head. We're only able to understand it because we live in history and we can go back and research, what is the Labor Party? Remember, Winston is, being kind of separated from history by the party's vast censorship and removal and destruction of the past. Also, the prole isn't the most eloquent in his speech, and he's also drinking more and more beer. So we can assume the answers that he's going to give are going to go down and down in quality. On page 93, there's an interesting quote, but all the relevant facts were outside the range of their vision. And here, Winston's referring to sort of the overall awareness of the proles. So I'd be interested to hear what you all think about that. What is Orwell referring to when he's talking about these relevant facts being outside the range of their vision? The proles just can't see certain things that are happening, and why that is. So now we're moving on to Mr. Charrington. This is the shopkeeper where Winston bought his journal. Mr. Charrington, he comments that the antique trade is dead because while history is dying, antiques are dying with them. Books have all been hunted down and destroyed. This reminds me of books like Fahrenheit 451, where you have the vast censorship and destruction of reading material. Capitalism was described to have created nothing of value in history. And while we can critique capitalism, certainly, and we will do that in some of our seminar discussions, it's obviously ironic and a little bit of satire here to think that capitalism has created nothing of value is a bit of an overstatement. Winston contemplates renting the old prole room to be alone. So Mr. Charrington shows him this old room above his shop, and Winston really thinks about, man, I could live here. But he's He's aware of how dangerous that is. But again, going back to the beginning of this chapter's discussion, we see how Winston is sliding down this kind of slope of taking more and more chances and being more and more risky with the fact that he might be caught and accused of thought crime. So be predicting what's going to happen as you're reading, seeing that he's taking more and more of these risks. Let's check out one more quote on page 98 here. On page 98, Orwell writes, Winston wondered vaguely to what century the church belonged. It was always difficult to determine the age of a London building. Anything large and impressive, if it was reasonably new in appearance, was automatically claimed as having been built since the Revolution, while anything that was obviously of an earlier date was ascribed to some dim period called the Middle Ages. So remember, this is the mutability of the past and the fact that the party is selectively choosing what parts of the past are going to represent the revolution. Obviously, all the good parts, right? Like, oh, that really beautiful church, that's ours. We did that. That beautiful cathedral, that's ours. We did that. And then a kind of like maybe a more of a slum area. Oh, well, that's from the capitalist times, right? Continuing on, the centuries of capitalism were held to have produced nothing of value. One could not learn history from architecture any more than one could learn it from books. Statues, inscriptions, memorial stones, the names of streets, anything that might throw light upon the past had been systematically altered. And so I especially want to hear your comments about that last sentence or two. The idea that statues, inscriptions, memorial stones, the names of streets, anything that might throw light upon the past had been systematically altered. And I want to know what you all think about that. So let's continue on. We're almost done with chapter 8. Winston continues to have these kinds of sensory flashes to the past, and this whole chapter kind of seems like that sort of impressionistic style where you're having these flashes of color, the smell of coffee, the sound of church bells, the sounds of old nursery rhymes that keep sucking him back to the past, but he can't quite go all the way back because he doesn't have the full memory of what that was like. Now, here's where the plot takes a turn. As he's leaving Mr. Charrington's shop, he sees the girl from the fiction department again. And so even before Orwell says this and Winston says it, now we as readers know that there is no longer coincidence here, right? We've seen this girl twice, and we've been making predictions about foreshadowing, right? What is Orwell trying to say is going to happen next? Now that we've seen her a third time in this very improbable place in the Prole area, we know that it is no longer a coincidence. And this is the rising action of a plot, right? This is the part where we're leading to a climax, we're building tension. And so most art is going to rely on that idea of tension and release of tension. So right now we're building tension, we're building suspense so that we stay invested in the story and that we have a larger payoff when we get to the climax. Which will be sort of the peak tension of the story. So once Winston gets home, he's really scared because he knows the thought police come for him at night. And he thinks, could this be the night? This might be it for me. And he considers suicide, but he can't do it. He notes that any sort of useful tool to commit suicide with has been confiscated, and it would be messy and difficult to commit suicide, and he doesn't have the heart to do it. But he does fear the torture that would come and the forced confessions that would come if he were arrested. And again, check out my Gulag Archipelago series for actual biographical and historical context about the torture that prisoners in the Soviet Union faced, thought criminals faced, and the forced confessions and show trials that they were made to attend. At the very end of the chapter, Winston recalls back to O'Brien and the prophecy that they will meet in a place where there is no darkness. And he's trying to predict, too, as we should be doing as readers, where is this place that there is no darkness that they'll meet? And Winston says maybe it's the imagined future, right? Maybe the future is a bright place, but it's a place where no one could ever see. Maybe it's even an afterlife, like a heaven or something like that. So we see here in this chapter 8 that Winston is sort of teetering between these two worlds, the past and the present. He's committing more and more consistent thought crimes, but he's really fed up with his party life. And it seems like he's almost like suicidally embracing being caught, or he's just so fed up that he's willing to take these big risks. He's mentally sort of breaking, and he's getting fed up with the party life. And the questions that we're left with is, will he be taken in the night? What is this dark-haired girl's motivation? Is he going to meet O'Brien? Is he going to go live with the Proles? What's going to happen to Winston? So now that we're at the end of part one, ask yourself these questions, make predictions of what's going to happen in part two, and I'll see you then.